you so much for joining us this morning. One of the things that we're going to be doing over the next series of weeks, actually, is telling some of the key stories that folks identified. We asked the question, when the church was really living out its calling over its history and in your past experience, what were some of the stories that really spoke to folks about when we're really following as God was leading us? And one of the stories that kept coming up was how the church responded in the wake of the tragedy, the horrible events of 9/11, and multiple folks told that story. And so knowing your involvement and your leadership in that, in the church's response, thank you for joining us. Would love to hear more about that, how that came about, how you've kind of thought that through.
Brian, I'm so glad to share this story. It's 20 years ago, and I haven't thought about it for a long time, but this has given me an opportunity to think about it and reflect on it. So I'll try briefly to tell the whole story. And the story really begins after that horrible event and the tragedy and crisis it created and the confusion it created at Illinois State University, when there was an evening vigil with the president of the university, Vic Buschini, the vice president, who was a very devout Catholic, the vice president of Illinois State, Al Goldfarb, who's a devout Jew, and the imam and Muslim student leader, Hassan Ilani. I coincidentally happen to know all three of those persons very well, and they spoke that night to the largest gathering I've ever seen on the quad at ISU. There were hundreds and hundreds of people, there may be thousands, but there was a huge, huge group. And in that night, at this university, a Jew, a Christian, and a Muslim said, we can have tranquility and peace in the chaotic world we live in. And that was just a powerful, inspiring moment to realize, despite all the crazy confusion around us, that Muslims, Christians, and Jews could assure the whole campus that we can have a community of peace. And out of that moment, I knew this Muslim imam and student leader, Muslim leader, because he was my doctoral student. I directed his dissertation. I saw him frequently. And so immediately after that event, I spoke to him about coming to this church and doing a Muslim-Christian dialogue, which he graciously agreed to do. I then went to our pastor and other church leaders and asked what they would think of it. It was strongly supported by our pastor. It was strongly supported by our church leaders. So I then got together with Hassan, and I began a crash course on Islam. And the first thing I did was read the Quran cover to cover and be taught on how Muslims understand the Quran, using the Quran as my guide. We then went into the history of Islam. We spent at least 6 weeks in intensely studying this. We then planned out an 8 or 9, I don't know how many, 6 to 8, 10 lessons, but clearly a curriculum that emphasized the dialogue between Christians and Jews, but the Muslim story that the Christians need to understand fully, from Muhammad and the beginning of that story to the present day. And that was what we developed. We then began at church, and it was exciting from the very beginning, and a little controversial for some.
Sure.
I did get telephone call. It was written up in the Pantograph. It became a big news item of a kind. And I did get calls from Christians in McLean County who were deeply worried about me, which was sort of interesting, that the Muslims were taking advantage of me, and they had secret plans for undermining our church or whatever. But that never was a concern of mine. And for sure, we need to make the point that the church leaders of First Baptist Church embraced and endorsed this idea before it ever got started.
Yeah.
And they supported it throughout the entire series. So it wasn't just my unique event from my unique knowledge of this particular Muslim, but it was truly an all-church commitment that I felt, and I felt glad to do that. Each time we met were 3 parts. We would have a topic that we were working on, like, as an example, the life of Muhammad, and who was Muhammad, and what was his life all about. And then we would take that, I would share an opening about that, and there would be a handout about that. And then I would turn to Hassan and say, now it's time for dialogue with the church. And he would then exchange. Dialogue was always key and critical. I live by Martin Buber's deep teaching about dialogue, and he once wrote the sentence that I have in my heart and my head. In this fragile life, dialogue can bring fulfillment in life when we have dialogue. Mm-hmm. And so I do believe in the importance of dialogue, and we truly had dialogue each week on a given topic that gave us a chance to really look at Muslims from the historic beginning to the present time and the current crisis we're in. They were wonderful conversations in our church. Now, following that, and it was wonderful, other things happened as a result. One was that we had a written curriculum because we always had handouts each time. Mm-hmm. And one of the persons who came was a Presbyterian pastor in the community. And afterwards, he said to Hassan, would you repeat this at our church? And it went to a Presbyterian church. Yeah. So it wasn't just for the First Baptist Church, it became a way for Christian Muslim dialogue for another church, and we had a complete curriculum they could use. We also were given invitations, Hassan and I, for service groups around town who were interested in this, and we would go as speakers. We did that on 2 different occasions for 2 different, and then I had other invitations to speak to people about Muslim-Christian dialogue. So it had its own moment for our church. Mm-hmm. And I think, Brian, the most powerful thing that came out of that were some people who would come to me and say, Paul, I just want you to know, I really appreciate this because I had never met a Muslim before. And you gave me a chance to meet a real Muslim, and he's really a nice man.
Yeah.
So that was so powerful because we live with these opaque imageries that we get on television of good guy, bad guy, Muslims, they must be radicals, they must be this and that. And we brought into our church a real Muslim who's a beautiful man with 2 children and a wife and a life of tranquility and peace as a human being, and who could talk with us in calm, peaceful ways and answer our questions without hesitation. Yeah. So that's the beauty of who we are and what we could do. Now, the other thing about that I now reflected upon coming here and being a part of this was my understanding of why that is so relevant to our church. And the reason is it's so much a part of being a Baptist. And I know in our history we have one of the greatest Americans of all time, Roger Williams, who taught everybody in his time and in our time the importance of knowing the church as the place where free people gather of conscience to study their Bible and express freely their convictions and understanding of the love of God that flows from that Bible for the whole world. Yeah. And I see this as occasion when we are really truly we lived a Roger Williams moment, mm-hmm. where we embraced our Bible and our faith to express the love of God for the world.
Thank you so much for saying that last part, because one of the things that was on my mind is that as Christians, if our faith is real, we feel like we have something worth sharing, but sometimes we operate in a way that we think that our message is unidirectional, right? So that it's just for us to go out and share. What is it about dialogue that speaks to you about following Christ, that relationship or that listening?
Yeah, that's such an important issue, and I've spent a lot of time thinking about that. The heart of dialogue is listening to the other, and that's the heart of respecting the other. Because in ordinary chatter and discussion and debate, we often already think we know the other's point of view, and we're trying to straighten them out.
Yes.
And so when two people are having a public quarrel, each trying to straighten out the other, they're just waiting for their chance to talk again, and they're really not listening. But dialogue and discussion are radically different. Discussion is more like percussion, boom, boom, boom. But dialogue is listening and learning. Listening so that you can say, do I understand you now? What is your point of view? Let me give you an example that came out of our dialogue with the Muslims. What's the difference between a Shia and a Sunni?
Right.
We never get that clarified on TV. And how to have a dialogue about Islam if you have never studied or thought about, even understood anything about a Shia point of view and a Sunni point of view.
Right.
Well, you need to listen to a Muslim try to explain that. Let me give you one more quick example. There's a lot of people really upset at Islam because they're so harsh on women and so oppressive. Well, they don't know the true story of Islam. Muhammad himself had a really strong-willed woman as his wife, and women were not in his world at all restricted and restrained. And there's a whole lot of Muslims in this world there's nothing in the Muslim faith that automatically makes women second-class citizens. That's just simply not true. But you don't know that. Well, one of our sessions dealt with that topic. Mm. But we had to listen to a Muslim explain the Muslim faith so we didn't have our own opaque ideas. So to love somebody else requires dialogue. There's no other way to love someone if you can't listen to their point of view, right, and then respond as a result of that. Mm-hmm. So dialogue is so critical to the faith journey for me.
It sounds like this would take us off in a whole different direction, but and we don't have time for that. But there's a piece just purely in our conversation with you and I that strikes me about how sometimes that discussion, that percussion image, is dependent entirely on our strength, our wit, our ability to try to convince or persuade, where dialogue leaves room for the Holy Spirit to be at work in both people.
In so many cases, the discussion and debate world, there's always a winner and a loser. It's always set up so obviously I'm the strong winner side and you're the weak loser side. And my job is to simply overwhelm you and bring you over to me. And dialogue doesn't allow you to make that assumption. It doesn't allow you to think you're already the winner and it's just a matter of conquering you. Now part of that is our false understanding of democracy, where we have elections where there's a winner and a loser. We have debates in Congress where there's winners and losers. So we live in a very competitive culture which sees everything as winning and losing. But if that's your only framework, it's not a biblical framework.
Right.
It's not the framework of Jesus Christ. Our framework starts with forgiveness. Our framework starts with opening our hearts and minds to the other, that we might be brothers and sisters in peace with each other. And that's a very, very different outlook on the world. So our culture drives us into notions of winning and losing and debating and conquering. And these are mental games we constantly play with each other. So how to help the Christian faith rediscover the gospel of dialogue? That's a challenge of our time. And the Muslim-Christian dialogue is one of the issues of our time, where unfortunately the churches often fell into the trap of thinking they have all the right answers, and Muslims are just the bad guys who don't understand yet. And if you start from that framework, we're in a peck of trouble, because there are billions of Muslims in the world, and they're not about to rush to Christianity to find the answer. So we got to live with them for the foreseeable future in a peaceful way.
Yeah. So, absolutely. Well, Paul, thank you so much for taking the time to share that, to tell that story. It's a powerful one. It's a piece of, for me, it suggests, a different kind of question is what does God's win look like? And, so just kind of that sense of, we're not seeking our win or your win. It's what's God up to. And
well, and let me just close by saying I'm so grateful to you, Brian, for leading us in the gospel of truth that allows dialogue to be at the center. You do that so well. And I come to this church to celebrate an open mind and an open heart, where God is embraced among all of us, even with our differences.
Yeah. Oh, that is so needed. Thank you so much, Paul. I appreciate your time.
Well, you're welcome.
Wisdom. Yeah.
You're welcome.